I share a unique relationship with my husband's younger brother. I'm about to confess an incident that happened with him. These days, people receive a good education, establish themselves in their careers, and then start dating. Compared to them, I got married at a very young age. As soon as I turned 20, I met my husband through an introduction by the adults and got married right away. Getting married too early, I feel a great regret for not having had a proper romantic relationship. Moreover, I feel envious of young women who confidently declare that marriage is a choice while they are busy with their own lives. Back in my young adult days, it was a time when it was considered good to get married early and have children soon. After getting married, I started living with my in-laws. My father-in-law was a conscienceless man who loafed around the house, leaving all the housework to my mother-in-law and always going out. He didn't even care if his children had meals on time, and he would only appear home for a short week or after the harvest season to sell the crops and steal my mother-in-law's money. It was his plan. He knew when the farm work would bring in money and came home to snatch it. My mother-in-law, clouded by the guilt of having such a husband, handed over the money without resistance. Is it okay for a head of the household to live like that? I heard of such cases, but I never thought it would happen to me. I asked my mother-in-law, "Where did father go?" after I married and moved in, but didn't see my father-in-law. She replied expressionlessly that he never said where he was going and that he'd come back someday. I heard that he inherited quite a bit of land from his father. How much tenant farming could be done on that land, but he was said to have no intention of working. Seeing my mother-in-law, who left for work before dawn, dressed in long clothes, broke my heart. I didn't know how to do housework, but I was overwhelmed by just doing the chores my mother-in-law asked me to do. I was mainly responsible for preparing meals and doing the dishes. During the farming season, we hired workers to plow the fields and plant seedlings. There weren't as many restaurants back then, so when lunchtime came, I prepared food and alcohol, and my mother-in-law reluctantly took it. My mother-in-law was extremely thin, probably because she spent all her time working and barely ate. It seemed like she was born to work. She always went to bed after me. Her hands never rested, whether sitting and sewing or cleaning up the room. I had cleaned once more. She worked all day in the fields and kept the house tidy. She was, after all, inherently diligent. I became pregnant and gave birth to a healthy son. My mother-in-law loved my child as if he were her own gold and jade. I was amazed at her overflowing energy. I wanted to become invisible and see inside her body if I could, while I was busy recovering my health and breastfeeding my child. My mother-in-law prepared delicious meals and was delighted to see her grandson. Thankfully, she was a very enlightened person for her time. I had planned to go to my parents' house for postpartum care, but my mother-in-law insisted that I stay at home and took great care of me. She made sure I didn't have to dip my hands in cold water or mop the floor. I admired how she could move so briskly despite her small and thin stature. If it weren't for the baby, I would have loved to work alongside her. However, since I couldn't do so, I vowed to repay her kindness in the future. My husband grew up as the only son in this house. When I got married, my father-in-law was so thrilled that he threw a party for 3 days. But as my pregnancy progressed into the second trimester, he left a few months before I was due to give birth and didn't contact us at all. When my son was about 100 days old, My father-in-law returned with a baby boy and handed him to my mother-in-law, saying, "I left because you didn't have a second child. This boy has no mother. He's definitely my son, so take good care of him." He then placed the baby on the floor. It was as if he knew that we had made a lot of money from selling rice that year. My mother-in-law sat with a stunned expression, and my father-in-law had the audacity to demand money again. For the first time, my mother-in-law lost her temper, asking, "What are you doing bringing a child here?" But my father-in-law knew exactly where my mother-in-law hid her money. He reached deep into a drawer and took a money envelope and left. My mother-in-law tried to chase after him, but he had already disappeared. I was dumbfounded, and my mother-in-law asked me to feed the baby, saying that life is precious and that we should take care of this child. Now that we don't have my father-in-law, what did the child do wrong? She added. I was producing a lot of breast milk, thanks to the nutritious meals my mother-in-law prepared. These days, breast pumps are available, and you can store breast milk. But back then, if the baby fed on one breast, the other would leak, and I would collect the milk in a bowl for storage. Breastfeeding is so convenient. You can feed the baby while lying down, and there's no need to bother with formula. Because I had plenty of breast milk, I also fed it to my brother-in-law. My son and brother-in-law, born in the same year, grew up like brothers. A few years after leaving, my father-in-law showed up in ragged clothes, and my mother-in-law admitted him to the hospital. He was diagnosed with cirrhosis. Not much later, his abdomen swelled with ascites, and despite treatment, he passed away a few days later. My mother-in-law was surprisingly calm and didn't lose her sanity, even in such a shocking situation. But she fell ill after being deeply hurt by the will my father-in-law left. The baby he brought home was indeed his child, and the baby's mother had passed away a few days after giving birth. The will asked us to take good care of the pitiful child. I was furious, but whenever I saw my angelic brother-in-law's face, I felt a sense of responsibility. All right, let's raise my son and him well. Let's make them get along as if they were twins. My mother-in-law passed away from terminal cancer when my son turned 5. My husband, who had spent his entire life working and never received his mother's love, bought a separate tombstone for her. In fact, it was also my mother-in-law's last wish. She had said that she didn't want to be next to him, even after death, because he had treated her so badly during her lifetime. I tried to treat my brother-in-law equally while raising my own son. He was a kind-hearted child and grew up well. My son, on the other hand, found it hard to understand why. He had to call someone his own age uncle and kept his distance. My son was a good student and went to college in New York. He married a woman he met while being an exchange student in France. My brother-in-law, having heard that his father did not work, was always helping with the farming. My husband told him to stop, saying that working at a young age would stunt his growth and drain his energy. But he loved helping with housework and farming. My brother-in-law was quick-witted and clever. Even though he was the same age as my son, he had a reliable side to him. Farming is never-ending work. Even after the busy farming season, you can't rest for a few days, because you have to prepare for the next season. My brother-in-law saved up his allowance and gave us a substantial amount of money, encouraging us to go on a vacation. I was proud of my brother-in-law for growing up so kindly, and I felt that I needed to take responsibility for him for the rest of my life. One day, my husband started having digestion problems. When we went to the hospital, we found out that he was in the late stages of stomach cancer. His daily routine of working on the farm, eating hastily when he came home, and then lying down, seemed to have put a strain on his stomach. During the 2 years my husband fought cancer, my brother-in-law helped with hospital visits. He said he couldn't just stand by when his father-like brother was in a bad situation, and his determination to save his brother was impressive. Coincidentally, my husband passed away on my brother-in-law's 28th birthday. My son came briefly from the U.S. for the funeral and then returned. To add to the misery, my son demanded money for his education. He asked when I thought I could continue to farm this vast land, and urged me to dispose of it and pass on the inheritance. I quietly sent him away, saying it wasn't the time yet. I saw no grief for his father in my son, and he offered no comfort to me, who had lost a spouse. All that was left after my husband's death were just my brother-in-law and me. My brother-in-law, who lived in the same house, comforted me. We comforted each other by remembering my husband, who had only suffered and then gone to heaven, and encouraged each other to cheer up and stand up again. My brother-in-law learned to grow specialty crops and started farming relentlessly. He managed to sell them at high prices and even found a market, despite earning a lot of money. My brother-in-law continued to work diligently as ever. He would go out to work at dawn, and when he came back home after the morning hours, he'd prepare breakfast and we'd eat together. Even though he was tired after eating, he would do some light housework before going out again. This routine was repeated every day. One summer, he knew very well that farmers shouldn't do this, but he got greedy and passed out from working under the scorching sun. When he didn't come home past the usual time, I felt something was wrong and went out to the field to look for him and found him collapsed. I quickly called an ambulance, and fortunately, he recovered after receiving an IV and came back home. When I scolded him sternly, saying, "Even if you love your work, you need to drink water and work. Do you know how scary heat stroke is?" He came into my arms and said, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake, and thank you for saving me." That night, we became one, moved by my brother-in-law's affection, who was like my own son, who had been raised on my milk. My brother-in-law had a sturdy body hardened by farm work, and with his inexhaustible stamina and youthful energy, he satisfied me. Since that day, we started to share a room. He asked me, "How much do you love me?" And I joked, "I don't know. We'll have to see more of each other." And he teased me all night, finding my playfulness cute. Since then, my brother-in-law has started to work considering his health. And these days, he even takes in trainees from an agricultural college to pass on his skills. Now that he's doing less physical labor, he says he has more energy and tries to be by my side every day. I feel both happy and overwhelmed by this. When I tell him to find a good partner and get married, he retorts, "My partner is right here. What are you talking about?" And I find my brother-in-law, who is all the more reliable for it, infinitely endearing. He's so cute when he brings a bunch of healthy foods and teases me, saying, "I know a widow's heart well," to his sister-in-law who raised him instead of his parents. My brother-in-law, who shows his intention to take responsibility for my old age, is so lovely, but I must send him off without regret when he eventually finds a partner.